of his book on Husserl's Cut, which I've read with great interest. So I appreciate the ways in which the uh, increasing connectivity among countries provides a challenge, a strategic challenge for Hungary. And I'd be interested to hear what conclusions the group comes to as you all wrestle with these issues, looking at your agenda. But what I'm going to do is take about 10 minutes to give a quick overview of what I think is the primary and defining geopolitical challenge of the era, which I think generally recognized as the defining or the primary geostrategic challenge of the era, namely the meteoric rise of China and the impact that's having on the US and the international order, of which the US has been the principal architect and guardian. And I'm going to try to present two big ideas and a challenge. The first big idea is Thucydides' trap. The second big idea is a mad world. And the challenge is essentially Henry Kissinger's challenge uh, to all of us to try to uh, develop a strategic concept that's big enough to encompass all of the contrary and competing impulses that are created by the first two ideas. So if we can go with, and maybe if we're taking good news from this, a possible future could look something more like a geopolitical Olympics as we're watching these amazing events occur just a little south of Budapest. So if we first question Thucydides' trap and China. So Thucydides' trap is the dynamic that occurs when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a ruling power. Now, the question is there a rapidly rising power? And the answer is you bet. Uh, if you're asking whether something's rising, take on your x-axis time and on your y-axis amount. And if the slope is going north, there's a clue. So is China rising? If we take the next slide here, here's China's share of global economy. First GDP, trade, manufacturing, defense spending. So is China rising? Next slide. China's share of the global GDP by the best metric for measuring economic power, PPP, here from 1990 comes from nowhere to number one. Next slide. That's a conclusion that most people don't want to accept, but if you look at the CIA's fact book, they recognize in purchasing power parity, China now has the largest economy in the world. That is, they buy and make the most stuff. Next slide. If you look at the green future, whether it's EVs or production of electricity through solar panels, or the elements that are captured in everything from a solar panel to a battery to indeed even to a chip, the green future is red. Next slide. If you look at electricity, China is in effect the first electrostate. The US, here's the production, total electricity generated by the US, which has essentially been flat for the last quarter century, now having to try to respond to the demand for more electricity by data centers and large language models and other AI. But China has been spurting ahead. So every year, China has been producing more new electricity production than the rest of the world combined. Every day, China adds another gigawatt to its electricity grid. Next slide. If you look at the raw materials, particularly critical materials, including rare earths, that became a topic of great discussion last spring. Again, China is the predominant producer. Next slide. AI in terms of the rivalry, again, I would say US big companies a bit ahead, but DeepSeek, a very small company, really very much in the running. And there are many other small companies coming forward, as well as the Alibaba Quinn or the Tencent Hainan, are both in the same zone. Next slide. So Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power. And as Thucydides taught us in his great history of the Peloponnesian War, it was the rise of Athens and the impact that this had, the fear that this instilled in Sparta, that made the war almost inevitable. Now, next, one of the first people to pick up on this idea was Xi Jinping. Here he is in 2017, just actually before my book was published, but I had done an article version which he had looked at, in which he argues that because of the dynamic that occurs when a rapidly rising power challenges a major ruling power, major powers should build a new model, a new form of great power relations. And I think that's an interesting proposition. Actually, it relates very much to the Kissinger challenge, which is my third point. Next slide. So here is one of the most fascinating characters on the planet for the moment, Elon Musk on Thucydides. And he's thought hard about this. I think we can hear what he says. Well, I'm sorry, the volume is not too good, but he's essentially saying what the quote says. So he says rightly that
Greece, but Athens grew stronger and stronger with each passing year, and everyone's like, well, that's inevitable that there's going to be a clash between Athens and Sparta. Well, how do we avoid that? And they saw it coming, and they still could not avoid it.
Okay, unfortunately, I think that's a good summary of about where we are now. Next slide. So if you had a chance to look at my book, Destined for War, you'll see it reviews the last 500 years, right from the rise of Spain to challenge Portugal at about the time of Christopher Columbus through the current situation. 12 of these 16 cases ended in war. So war is normal for great power rivalries, but 4 of the cases in not war. So war is not inevitable. Say it again, war is not inevitable. It's simply that business as usual or statecraft as usual, we should expect history as usual. And therefore the challenge is to reach beyond that to something better. Next slide. So that's essentially the argument in Destined for War. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would recommend it. I think each of the chapters addresses questions that people are struggling with today. And while I might do a little bit of editing if I were rewriting it today, I would say the main theses and the main evidence is points to the conclusion that business as usual, statecraft as usual, we should expect history as usual, which would be a catastrophic war, but that's not inevitable. That actually defines the challenge for statecraft today, including the challenge for statecraft by middle powers like Hungary. So that's point 1, Thucydides' trap and a Thucydidean rivalry. Now, a second big idea, if we take the next slide, a mad world. For those of you who don't remember the nuclear age, during the Cold War, as the US and the Soviet Union each acquired arsenals that were capable of withstanding the other's first strike and still retaliating in a way that destroyed the attacker, strategists invented an acronym, MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. So mutual assured destruction is a condition in which even if I deserve to be strangled, if you give into your temptation to strangle me, you are in effect committing delayed suicide. If you want to have a, a, a natural version of this, it's uh, inseparable symbiosis or inseparable conjoined Siamese twins in human beings. So these were a couple of people who performed in circuses in the U.S. In the beginning of the 20th century. Uh, so nuclear mad is a situation in which the U.S. and China each have robust arsenals, such that if either attacked the other in a full-scale nuclear war, both would be destroyed. This is not the only realm in which we are living in a mad world today in the 21st century. In climate, we live on a small planet enclosed in a biosphere in which each nation's greenhouse gas emissions go into the same biosphere, and therefore, on the current trajectories, either the US or China, the number one and number two greenhouse gas emitters, could make a biosphere in which no one could survive. AI mad is another topic worth discussion if we had time, but basically the possibility that AI will that the advance of AI will produce a artificial general intelligence way smarter than any human being, and therefore conditions in which possibly both the US and China, the two AI leaders, could find themselves in another version of MAD, is one that's been much discussed now that I've been trying to explore. I think the jury is out. In the financial and economic arena, we saw last spring, after President Trump raised tariffs on China to 145%, something never seen before, essentially an embargo for trade. And China responded by choking the rare earth magnets on which the US economy is dependent. We found the two economies basically so entangled and so dependent on each other that they have a version of MAD or at least economic disruption. And then there's a bunch of others. If we think about COVID and pandemics or terrorism, and even more importantly, I would say, or equally important, the irresistible benefits of deepening global integration. And actually, Ballas's book on Husserl's cut reminds us that the powerful forces that are thickening connectivity have great benefits as well as produce risks. So second big idea, we're living in the 21st century in a mad world in which the first idea, the Thucydidee and rivalry, is playing out. So therefore, question mark, what's the challenge? Next slide. Henry, to compete or to cooperate? I give this to my students in my course and even to policymakers in Washington and Beijing. I suggest you take a page and write at the top of it, incentives to compete. And if you can't make 10 bullet points, you should go back and do your reading and think again. Then you should turn a sheet over to the back side and write on the top of it, incentives to cooperate for the US and China. And again, if you can't make 10 bullet points, talk to one of your colleagues. Which should be more compelling? And I would think the answer myself is both. Next slide. So Henry Kissinger, who died 2 years ago, was my mentor. And he kept talking both to people in Washington and in Beijing and to people like me, his colleagues, about the need for a strategic concept comprehensive enough to capture these two simultaneous contradictory imperatives: to compete in what's the fiercest Thucydidee and rivalry of all times, and that's baked into the structure, and at the same time to cooperate for each of us to survive, which is the 21st century conditions in which this rivalry is occurring. So next slide. Henry, as he just 7 months before his death a couple of years ago, became more pessimistic about the likelihood that we would avoid great power war. he saw, as he said, he kept saying that he was hearing the echoes of 1914 louder and louder. And certainly in Hungary, you can remember what happened in 1914 when the Archduke was assassinated, an event that was a big event in Austro-Hungarian Empire, but which in New York hardly made the front page, but within 5 weeks was a spark that had produced a fire that became a conflagration that basically destroyed all of Europe. So the question is, in such conditions, can the US and China, with the help of others, find a way to some version of an equilibrium that would avoid these catastrophic consequences? Next slide. As we search this space, one arena to look at is where people came to when they recognized that the US-Soviet rivalry was in a mad world. And here's Henry writing about Kissinger and Nixon as Nixon became president in 1969. And the proposition here that even though this was a fierce Cold War, he says there could be no higher duty than to prevent the catastrophe of nuclear war. So on the one hand, there's a rivalry with an evil empire, which Henry and Nixon certainly believed. On the other hand, there could be no higher duty than prevent the catastrophe of nuclear war. Next slide. So John Kennedy came to a similar thought after surviving the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the US and Soviet Union went face to face over the Soviets' attempt to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, Kennedy thought there was about a 1 in 3 chance this would end in a nuclear war that would have killed hundreds of millions of people. He reflected on this, and again, just 5 months before he was assassinated, he gave a very important speech. If you've never read it, I would suggest you read it. It's the American University speech in June 1963, in which he says, okay, we're not going to be able to end our differences right now. So we have to focus on making the world safe for diversity. This was again before diversity became a code word in the US. This is diverse as a good free world, which he thought the US and the free world were, and an evil empire, which he thought the Soviet Union and its domination of countries like Hungary was. But nonetheless, we could not continue to have confrontations like the Cuban Missile Crisis, because if we did, we would destroy ourselves. And as he says here, in the final analysis, we inhabit a small planet, we breathe the same air, we're all mortal. Next slide. The Chinese history includes so many fascinating examples, and I'm an advocate of applied history in which we look at previous experiences and see what clues we can learn for challenges we face today. About 1,000 years ago, the Song dynasty was facing a northern a tribe, the Liao, had been unable to defeat them for some time. And so they negotiated what's called a Chanyan Treaty, in which it's been characterized by some Chinese historians as a rivalry partnership. In some arenas, they agreed they would remain fierce rivals. In other areas, they would be thick partners. And that seems like a contradiction, and to some extent it is, but it created a relationship that maintained the peace for 120 years. So I would say we should look for clues like that. Next slide. So this is concluding. President Trump has said repeatedly he believes the US and China working together can solve almost all the problems. And I think if you've read carefully Trump's national security strategy and his national defense strategy, and if you've been watching the other statements that he's made, he's preparing for a summit in which he will go to Beijing in April, and in which I'm forecasting that the US and China will announce a new frame, a new concept for this relationship, maybe even something like a new partnership for peace and prosperity. But that remains to be seen. And the announcement of a concept would be valuable, especially a concept that emphasizes the side of that reminds us that we live in a mad world in which we have to have a partnership for peace and prosperity for our own survival. At the same time, all the structural factors make us fierce rivals. So I think the idea of the Olympics may be may be fruitful. So you remember the Olympics motto. Oh, it's faster, higher, stronger, together. And maybe that's an idea for the US and China going forward. I'd be happy to take your questions or any comments.
Thank you, Professor. And for those of you in the audience who haven't read his book, I do highly recommend it. So I have so many questions, but I think we might only have time for one. So let me jump right into that one. You're joining us virtually, but we're having this conversation at the Budapest Global Dialogue in a country that knows all too well that history and international orders are rarely kind to countries caught between great powers. So how can smaller states like Hungary or many of the other countries that are represented in our audience here navigate this environment that you've laid out? You did mention a few times that the US and China might need some help in avoiding Thucydides' trap, so how can these small states maybe be a part of that and also avoid becoming victims of the might makes right sort of politics that doomed Milos, for example, in classical Greece?
Great question, and I'm sorry that we're not there for a long conversation about it. Let me try to be brief, and then if we want more, I'm happy to do. I think first, as Hungarians think about the picture, the small countries do not have to have only small ideas. It may seem a little pretentious to imagine that Hungary could have thoughts about how the US and China could better relate. But my inspiration in this space is Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. So Singapore is a small city-state, much smaller than Hungary. And Lee Kuan Yew, the founder and the longtime prime minister, was, looked at the world with a clear eyes. As Henry Kissinger said about him, he had a almost unique strategic acumen, and his ideas were so powerful that successive American presidents went to Singapore to talk and listen to him, and successive Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, went repeatedly to Singapore to talk to Lee Kuan Yew. So I would say small countries can think big ideas, and including big ideas about how larger countries might relate to each other. That's why, as I mentioned to start, I think that Balsas's book on the Husserl's Cut that captures the ways in which connectivity is going to intensify, and therefore the shock of the aftershock effects of the primary axis of international politics will impact all the other countries, means that that's a reality. So they have a stake and they have a reason to be able to they have a motivation, a need to be helpful in trying to help the larger powers think about how they can be rivals and partners at the same time, or how they might even have a new partnership for peace and prosperity. And I think Hungary, because it's managed under Orban very good relations with Trump and with Xi and China, may have a special opportunity.
Well, I've gotten the go-ahead to throw in one more quick question. So I'd love to look to the future a little bit and see if do you think we're heading in a more hopeful or concerning direction in the moment? I mean, I see an interesting paradox in the US right now where the current Trump administration has a lot of the most prominent China hawks in it. At the same time, though, Trump seems to be pursuing a pretty good personal relationship with Xi. Just a few days ago, there's another phone call that Trump, in his usual style, described as excellent. So, do you think that we're continuing to edge towards Thucydides' trap at the same pace, or have we maybe started to pull back a little bit, back from the brink, so to speak?
Well, that's a great question, and I think good for you. You're obviously reading the vibes and the tea leaves. So, point one, this is and will be the fiercest Thucydidean rivalry of all times. China will continue to be a rapidly rising power. The US will continue to be the major ruling power. The impact of this structurally is just baked into the situation. Now, if China should implode, which I don't think is likely, but it could, remember most dynasties in China have actually collapsed before this long of Communist Party rule. So China could go back to something like the end of the Qing dynasty. You could have decades in which China is basically embroiled internally. The US could implode. I don't believe that could happen, but it will happen, but it could happen. There's nothing is guaranteed as permanent in this world. And obviously there are many stresses and strains within the US today. So that's for sure. So I would say 75% of the issue is baked in, and that as China continues to rise and as the US struggles with that fact and the impact of it, basically the seesaw of power keeps shifting with all the predictable effects. And that then is reflected both in our government for many, many people, who, as you say rightly, are China hawks, and then in our population and politics, where there's an increased hostility or suspicion and hostility of China, and vice versa, same thing for China. So the interesting fact then is, what about the agency of leaders and the agency of these two leaders? And for President Trump, I think there's no question he is not a China hawk. Actually, I wrote a piece about this in February of last year in the Washington Post, just laying out what he had said during the campaign. And if you take the statements that he makes about China and about Xi Jinping and about his aspirations, he actually is eager to have a new and different kind of relationship with China. Now, whether he'll be able to succeed in that aspiration and whether Xi Jinping will be a good partner in that regard, and how you'll work out the details, I would say that's to stay tuned. But if we need a new strategic concept and we need it to shape the relationship, I would say this is a promising possibility.
Well, on that note, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Allison. Let's give him a big round of applause. Up next is our final panel discussion titled The Great Reset, Rebuilding the Global Economy. This session asks whether the global economy is undergoing a reset and what a fairer, more resilient model might look like in the decades ahead. To moderate this session, we have with us Dorina Molnar, Managing Director of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. And she will be joined by Andrew Peake, Director of the Adrian Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative at the Atlantic Council, László György, Government Commissioner for Economic Strategies and the Teach for Hungary program here in Hungary, and last but not least, Sujan R. Chinoy, Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. Let's welcome our experts to the stage.